apparently we can describe water as being extraordinarily sticky. Water is H2O, and H2O means two hydrogens and an oxygen, and the hydrogens at the side of one molecule are attracted to the oxygen on the next molecule along, and they bond in a thing called hydrogen bonding. They bond because of the positive charge in the hydrogen atoms, and that happens because of the electrons spending most of their time inside the water molecule, and because they cannot reach the surface of the molecule, the outside ends up positively charged. It's because of all these temporary hydrogen bonds that water's an extraordinarily sticky fluid, and if you go just a bit inside the water, just away from the surface, all the sticky molecules are in constant tug of war with their neighbours, and because they have the same strength, all the upwards pulls cancel out the downwards pulls, and all the left pulls cancel out the right pulls, and so on, so no individual molecule feels any force at all, but at the surface it's different. Since the molecules at the surface of the water don't have any more molecules above them, since there's no liquid above the surface of the liquid, there are no upwards pulls to cancel out the downwards pulls, and so the surface molecules get pulled back down into the liquid, and this is to do with surface tension, and when you blow a bubble you're forcing the surface of the liquid to expand, which it's reluctant to do, and so it needs to pull up more molecules from deeper inside the liquid to allow for the expansion. Apparently it takes work to do this, and so the surface tension in the bubble shrinks it into a shape with the smallest possible surface area for the volume of air contained inside it, and that shape is a sphere. The surface tension on a sphere lets certain things out through the surface into the bubble and keeps certain things in. It has poor auditory and reading comprehension and fluent but nonsensical oral and written expression. For example, the iridescent colours on its surface are caused by interfering light rays and are determined by the thickness of the film of the bubble. When the light hits the surface of the bubble, it does not penetrate the film. In some cases it reflects off the outer surface of the film, and in other cases it enters into the breadth of the film, reflects back and forth between either end of the surface, and then is reflected out. The result is a number of different rays of light. The hue of the dome itself depends entirely on the interference of these rays proportional to the thickness of the film and the wavelength of the incidence of the light. When the two light waves combine, they reach each other crest to crest or crest to trough. When they meet crest to crest, they add to one another and reinforce their combined effect. They are often unaware of their surroundings and may present a risk to themselves and others around them. When they meet crest to trough, they cancel one another out so that they have no effect, because for every up vibration in one wave there is a corresponding down vibration in the other wave, and because of this tug of war, no individual molecule feels any force. At all, since the point to the self is a first-person pronoun, white light is made up of all colours, all wavelengths, and when one of these colours is subtracted by interference, you see its complementary colour, which may be linked by grammatical type. For instance, blue light is subtracted from white light, then you see yellow. Romanian evidence leading up to the period of the late 9th century AD shows that individual speakers in the Italian peninsula thought that they were speaking classical Latin, even though their speech varieties had by then diverged so substantially that the term as they would have understood it no longer applied. You can describe the situation as a large solid space under a solid but elastic dome, the dome overhead being the regulatory normative influence of classical Latin. The records that remain are largely liturgical texts, legal documents, contemporary prescriptive dramas, letters written between scholars and clerics, and notes like glosses and contemporary popular songs written in margins by scribes. Missing from these documents are the errors ordinarily present at a time of covert diglossia. Morphological errors arrive when morphology means word internal grammar, but no errors of pronunciation or lexicon. During the 9th century AD, we can describe water as being extraordinarily sticky. Apparently it was an extraordinarily diglossic situation because it was covert, and covert means the entire community was multilingual and none of them noticed. Liturgical reading in church was characterised by the vertical model of communication, and the vertical model of communication is one-way communication from the top down. The majority of the population could not read in the Bible, and the Bible was in classical Latin, reached the congregation by being read out loud in church. Gradual phonetic changes mean sound changes, were altering the phonological structure. Phonological structure means the structure of meaningful sounds governing the phonetic structure of a language, of the spoken language, so that by the 9th century some of the completed change classical Latin had undergone include apocopy. Apocopy means word final elision of word final terse and final stress vowels. Syncope means mid-word elision of vowels. Elision means deletion of intertonic. Intertonic means between two stressed syllables. Vowels, loss of consonant length distinction, and palatalization. Palatalization means pronouncing a phoneme against the hard palate of t, k, g into affricates and then fricatives. Affricates and also fricatives are types of phonemes. Because they all have the same strength, all the upwards pulls cancel out the downwards pulls, and all the left pulls cancel out the right pulls, and so on, so no individual molecules feel any force at all. At this time, the written language remained unchanged throughout, so what had once been a phonetically written language, phonetically written written means one sound per letter had become as phonetically unpredictable as written English, and in written English a single written letter can mean one of many things. By the late 9th century, phonological changes progressed to such a degree that if the liturgical texts were read out one sound per letter as they were written, then they'd be incomprehensible because it would mean pronouncing sounds and whole syllables no longer preserved in everyday speech. All variation and phonological innovation thus continue to be held in check by the normative Latin dome overhead because of the electrons spending most of their time inside the water molecule, and because they cannot reach the surface of the molecule, it ends up positively charged. It's because of all these temporary hydrogen bonds that water's an extraordinarily sticky fluid, and if you go just a bit inside the water, away from the surface, all these sticky molecules are in a constant tug of war with their neighbours, and because they have the same strength, all the upwards pulls cancel out the downwards pulls, and all the left pulls cancel out the right pulls, and so on, so no individual molecules feel any force at all. But at the surface it's different. When the bubble's wall is about as thin as it can be, even thinner than the wavelength of visible light, then the two reflected rays will always meet crest to trough and will destructively interfere. Then all the visible rays cancel each other out, and the bubble looks black as no reflection is visible at all. The parts of the film that have turned black and cease to allow reflection are those areas in which the bubble skin is most fragile and most liable to break. Those areas in which the membrane is at its most fragile are indicated by gestures that occupy the boundary of the visual/gestural language. Visual/gestural languages mean sign language, and BSL means British Sign Language. And when a BSL interpreter sees a physical gesture made by a hearing person whose speech she's translating, she makes the exact same gesture, but in sign language, and the gesture is onomatopoeic too. Gestures are identical physically, but differ in currency because of the gesture of the original speaker acting directly on the room, while the gesture of the interpreter remaining within the language. Apparently, language is a barrier to direct communication. So while the non-linguistic gesticulation can act directly upon the physical space around it, the linguistic gesture cannot, and so there is an irreconcilable gap between two apparently identical gestures because H2O means two hydrogens and an oxygen. Deictic categories in BSL are equally divorced from the space around them, and so the status of onomatopoeic gesture of the BSL interpreter is reinforced by the behaviour of deictic terms in both auditory oral language, which means oral languages, and visual gestural languages. Deictic categories are orientational features of language, and orientational features of language are collectively linguistic terms that have anaphoric or cataphoric reference points in time, place, and in the speaking event between interlocutors. Anaphoric means referring back, and anaphoric reference points mean linguistic units used to refer back to something that had happened before. Cataphoric means referring forward, and cataphonic reference points means linguistic units used to refer forward to something happening after, and so deictic words are bound to either a linguistic or extra-linguistic context for their interpretation. They are dependent on meaning for contextual reference, such as place, time, and the speaking event going on between interlocutors. In English, deictic terms are pronouns like me versus you, pronouns like here versus there, and verbs like go versus come. During the early ages of language acquisition, one of the many errors a child will make is to mix up these deictic terms. From time to time, he or she will mistakenly say you when he or she means to refer to him or herself. In sign language, some deictic terms are constituted by pointing at its most straightforward. A point to the self is a first person pronoun, a point to someone else is a second or third person pronoun. A child acquiring sign language tends to make errors when he or she points to things in rooms in a way that a non-signer would not. From time to time, he or she will mistakenly point to the person he or she is addressing when he or she means to refer to him or herself. So, in the context of sign language, a point does not end at the thing it points at. Pointing does not get out and act upon the room as it does in the context of speech. Language erects a barrier to the actions of the gestures upon the room. When a non-signer supplements her spoken language with gesture, her actions really are in the world and can reach things and point to things. But when the signing child points or the interlocutor produces an onomatopoeic gesture, it is not part of the room but part of the language. A division intervenes so that there is no way of assuming a direct correspondence between the real-world location of the point and the meaning of the point. It is specifically at the point of that visual analogy between the two kinds of pointing gestures, which otherwise belong to entirely separate levels of representation, that of thinning in the membrane dividing language and non-language can be perceived. The visual equivalence between gestures creates a relationship between two otherwise unrelated events. When a decree came from Charlemagne in 813 for the clergy to pronounce Latin one sound per letter, the liturgy became incomprehensible overnight, and congregations realized that if this was Latin, it wasn't what they were speaking. A widespread recalibration took place as speakers ceased to consider their own speech in relation to the normative Latin dome that had been dominating their linguistic horizon and reinforcing the impression that language on the peninsula had been homogeneous. Sufferers were no longer approximating the language of Latin, nor were their speech varieties approximating any other language. When the dome shattered, it legitimized every peculiarity of speech, and each minute variety became itself